This morning's reading continues through Hebrews and picks up after last week's reading, which gave a litany of the faithful in the Hebrew Scriptures and spoke of how they had run with perseverance the race before them. Now the writer suggests how they, Moses, Abraham, and many others, how they continue to fit into the story of God's salvation since they lived and died before the coming of Jesus. So this is from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 to 16. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth, for people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, He has prepared a city for them. Thanks be to God for these words of life.
Will you join your hearts with mine in prayer? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. In the pantheon of major holidays, I must confess Halloween is not my favorite. It's not my favorite. It's in its current popular incarnation, the day seems to me, in the words of the late journalist Marjorie Williams, just a silly, gaudy night that strains at symbolism. Please don't throw eggs at my house. Now, I know these are fighting words for some, and I'm not trying to pick a fight. Williams' essay rather came to mind this week as I reflected on the text from Hebrews from this second week of our sermon series on faith. Her essay about her experience of Halloween and her reflections on it is called The Halloween of My Dreams. And her contentious assessment of the holiday comes from there. And it was written as she was in the throes of treatment for stage 4 liver cancer at the age of 46. It's the last piece in the marvelous collection of her work, The Woman at the Washington Zoo. She writes, "I was the one who insisted on the body glitter," she says, of helping her 9-year-old daughter Alice complete her rock star costume. She insisted on the body glitter, though she is usually the mother concerned with tucking in her daughter's shirt and scrubbing off the temporary tattoos. She insisted on the body glitter. She insisted, even though she, quote, like any mother knows, glitter is the work of Satan, which is true. Clearly. And even though Marjorie herself is such a, quote, task mistress of literalism, that she struggles to take on another role, to play a part, which is, for so many, much of the joy of Halloween. That year, though, she insisted. So she prepares Alice to go out with her friends, and then records this moment. As her momentum carried her to the top of the stairs, Alice looked back and tossed me a radiant smile. She had become my glimmering girl. She looked like a rock star. She looked like a teenager. She looked absolutely stunning. She thundered down the stairs in those shoes, and as the front door slammed behind her, it came to me what fantasy I had finally easily entered this Halloween. I'd just seen Alice leave for her prom, or her first real date. I'd cheated time, flipping the calendar 5 or 6 years into the future. The character I'd played was the 52-year-old mother I will probably never be. It was effortless. Her husband edited this collection and notes at the end of this essay that a month after Marjorie wrote this, her oncologist concluded that there was no further treatment to recommend. She died at home on January 16th, 2005, 3 days after her 47th birthday. I love this essay and this collection, though it makes me weep. I weep more easily than Grant, clearly, and perhaps more easily than others. But I love this essay because she writes so poignantly, so honestly about the experience of illness, but of all that she sees. Williams was a reporter for years who did a number of profiles of people in Washington on all sides of the aisle. She did all kinds of wonderful writing, that most of which is collected in this book. But it is those personal essays that reflect so clearly her feelings of loss, of what she knows she's going to miss, what she knows her children are going to miss, and what she can't protect them from. And yet in the midst of those, there's also hope. Her daughter will go on a date, will become a teenager, will grow up. Even as she grieves her own ending life, she celebrates the promise of her daughter. I am not such a fan of Halloween, but I do love All Saints' Day, which we celebrate on November 1st, or in many Protestant churches on the first Sunday of November, when we call to mind all the saints who have come before us across generations and those we have loved throughout history, and those who have affected our own lives day to day. It is a beautiful day of both loss and hope, of grief and promise. I cannot get through singing For All the Saints without weeping. It's not even worth an experiment. We should certainly sing it, but I promise you, if we do, I'll be crying. This challenge of living into both the grief and the loss of our lives and the hope and promises of God and communion with God, of salvation here and now and in the eternal life, these are parts of our story today, but they have been parts of the Christian story for a long time. The early church in particular wrestled with this. They felt that they had been promised that not one from this generation would pass away before Jesus came again in glory. They would see the fullness of God revealed. But then they started dying. The temple fell. Emperors crushed the communities of faith. They wondered how, in the midst of grief and loss, they could continue to live with hope into God's promises. What did it mean, they wondered, that those who had been faithful for generations had not seen the fulfillment of the promise of God? Not just those living in the days after Jesus, but those who came before, Abraham and Moses. All of those many names listed a bazillion times in Mike's sermon last week. I will not run through the litany again. What did it mean, though, that they had lived faithfully and yet died waiting for the coming day of the Lord, for the Messiah? Was God's promise unrealized for them? The writer of Hebrews says, no. God's promise was realized, was real for them, even though they saw it only from a distance. Even though they were, as seekers, as sojourners, still looking for a homeland, for that final realization and manifestation of God, the promise was still real, was still for them. Still, those words of promise were written over 2,000 years ago, and the world is still broken. We are still seeking a home. We are still seeking the fullness of God. We still mourn those we love who have died. We still mourn all those who are hurting in the world. I know we finished the Broadway in the Bible series, but I will once again ask for your forgiveness by revisiting a Broadway show now, only 2 weeks really after we finished the Broadway in the Bible series. But I will blame Stephen for it fully, but only because he's so good. So we were planning the service earlier in the week, and I was reading this text from Hebrews that had been selected, and I was like, I have no idea where this is going. He wanted to know because he was waiting for the prayers for the bulletin. I'm like, yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with this. So I read it to him, and he said, oh, we need to sing Beautiful City from Godspell. And I did not recall Beautiful City from Godspell. I confess yet again, I saw Godspell once, I think, in high school in a very cheesy production and totally wrote it off for the rest of time until this week when he spoke a word of truth to me and I started listening. But so the story of Godspell is basically the story of Jesus. It's taken from the Gospels, largely the parables of Matthew. And so the sort of troupe performs a number of different parables, and then there's musical numbers to tie them together. And they're sort of, the ensemble is, they're sort of character types, but then there are a couple named people, namely Jesus and Judas. And the first act sort of focuses on these parables, and then the second act goes into the Last Supper and the crucifixion. Much like Jesus Christ Superstar in some ways, but better choral numbers and more cheerful, even though it ends with a crucifixion. So at one point, Jesus, the character of Jesus, sings a song with the ensemble called Save the People. When will thou save the people, O God of mercy, when? The people, Lord, the people. Flowers of thy heart, O God, are they. Let them not pass like weeds away. Their heritage a sunless day. God, save the people. Shall crime bring crime forever, strength aiding still the strong? Is it thy will, O Father, that men shall toil for wrong? No, say the mountains, no, say the skies. Man's clouded sun shall brightly rise, and songs be heard instead of sighs. God, save the people. It's really a joyful song, and it's lovely. It will make your day. You should go find it on YouTube, or better yet, buy the soundtrack. It's lovely, but it is asking for God to do this work, to bring about salvation for the people. It casts a vision where people's sighs turn to songs. That is how we know God's salvation. Jesus offers here a vision of what is to be, and that salvation is not just about heaven. It is how folks might be saved from despair, how folks might live in joy. This is not some far-off home with God, but something here. Jesus then, but the show continues, and by the end of the show, Jesus sings another song, and the focus remains, in some ways, on the despairing of the world and the hope for what might be. But the actors have changed. Jesus and the people are no longer only waiting for God to act, but are hearing a call themselves. There are so many things that I love about that song and that I've heard as I've listened to it on repeat practically all week. But the one that strikes me the most as Christians seek out to live in this moment is these few lines, slowly but surely mending, brick by brick and heart by heart. In the Christian church in the 20th and 21st centuries, evangelical Protestants spent a lot of time and focus on mending hearts. The work of relationships, of families, of marriage, those became questions that were the focus of sermon series and Bible studies and all the things. In the mainline church, we've focused on social issues, on social justice. My second book was on sexuality, and one of you asked me shortly after I started here, why in God's name I had decided to write that book. Do you need the money? Publishing is a terrible way to make money. So no, that wasn't it. But part of it was that there seemed to me a hole in the conversation in the mainline church, that when we had talked about sexuality, we had only talked about inclusion. We hadn't talked about relationships, or how it is to be in love, or how it is to be vulnerable with another person. I wanted to speak into that. And as we go forward as the church, it seems that doing both of those things, thinking about structural issues, building the city brick by brick, and mending our hearts, mending our souls one by one, we have to do both of these things together. We can't do it without naming the brokenness of our world. We can't do it without naming the despair we sometimes experience. I have the collection of Martin Luther King sermons that I had when I was doing my graduate work, and it's marvelous to see the things that I stuck Post-it notes on, to see the things that made me feel passionate enough to write in my margins. His last sermon is called, "I See the Promised Land." And the editor of this collection writes, just a few days before King gave the following speech, one of his demonstrations was taken over by disgruntled people who had grown weary of the slow pace of Dr. King's nonviolent resistance strategy. Looting, many injuries, and shootings ensued. Dr. King confessed privately that he had become depressed. He felt like a failure. But there were many people who still believed in him and in the power of nonviolent resistance. They rallied to offer him and the movement encouragement and hope. And so this sermon, this speech, came in the midst of that moment. He begins with a thought experiment, saying if God invited him to see or to live in any point in human history, when would he want to be? And he marvels at all the wonderful things that he might have seen and known in the past. Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now that's a strange statement to make because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around. That's a strange statement. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. We cannot in the church ignore the darkness and wish only for light. We have to keep looking forward. We have to look around as well to see fully our world as it is. King takes up the question of how it is that we are to find hope and asks about the tradition of the church of looking towards that promised day, that promised land with God in some distant future. He wrote, "It's all right to talk about long white robes over yonder in all of its symbolism, but ultimately people want some suits and dresses and shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey, but God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day. It's all right to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day God's preacher must talk about the New York, the New Atlanta, the New Philadelphia, the New Los Angeles, the New Memphis, Tennessee. This is what we have to do. This is hard work, and indeed I don't know if we should take hope or despair, just like in knowing that Mother Teresa often felt so far from God. She felt far from God, holy moly. But there is hope there, to know that we can continue to live as God's people. We can still live into the promise of God's love. We can still hope for the beautiful city, even when we see only glimmers of it, even when sometimes it seems so dark. This was King's last sermon. He was indeed assassinated the next day. He concluded, "While I don't know what will happen now, we've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Rabbi Tarfon, a Jewish rabbi, famously wrote, "It is not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either." As we look to our own lives as individuals, as communities, we all have moments of poignancy, of grief and loss, but also of hope and promise. Broken as we are, broken as our world is, God is not ashamed to be called our God. Indeed, our God is preparing a beautiful city for us, with us. The good news of Jesus Christ. Amen.